Margaret Hale split the heel of the loaf with both thumbs, deliberate and reverential. The way you handle something you understand cannot be replaced. She pressed the larger portion into her younger sister's lap. Clara's fingers wrapped around it without thought, the instinct of a child whose body has learned to receive what little the world offers. Her legs lay still beneath the rough wool draped across her knees. They had not obeyed her in nearly 4 months. The wheelchair beneath her sat pitched sideways in the frozen mud, one axle bent, the whole frame shuddering in the January wind, like something barely holding its own opinion of whether to stay upright. "Take the big one," Margaret said, almost no voice behind it. "You take it," Clara said. "You're the one walking." Neither of them had put food in their mouths since Tuesday. It was Friday now. Across the iced-over road, a stranger on horseback had gone still. If this story moves something in you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs it. Now, let us begin. Thomas Arden had been walking his horse for 13 days, without a destination he could name. He was not fleeing anything, at least not in any way a court could charge. He was simply a man who had stopped belonging to places the way most men do, stopped feeling the gravitational pull of a hearth, a doorway, a woman's voice calling supper, the way ordinary human beings are supposed to feel it. 63 years old, wide in the chest, narrow in the expectations he carried. His hands were the color and texture of old saddle leather left too long in alternating sun and rain. Decades of rope work and cold weather had cracked every knuckle and stained the skin in ways that no amount of washing had ever addressed. He wore a long canvas coat the color of river mud and a hat that had survived more weather systems than most men twice his age. He had no destination. He was honest enough with himself to say the word plainly in his own mind without dressing it up. He had sold his cattle operation outside of Miles City 16 months ago, and since then he had simply moved the way a river moves in early spring, not because it wants to go anywhere in particular, but because being stationary was something it had simply forgotten how to do. Caldwell Fork, Montana was not a town that received strangers warmly. Thomas could feel that the moment he turned his horse off the main road and let the buildings press in around him against the gunmetal sky, wood smoke lifting thin and reluctant from chimney mouths, horses at their posts with their heads bowed into the cold. Men moving the way men move in towns where something private has been decided, quick, purposeful, eyes trained past you rather than at you, like they've made a collective agreement about which faces are worth acknowledging. He was passing through, one night in a boarding house, perhaps 2, then west again toward wherever came next. He was 2 blocks shy of the boarding house when he saw her. The girl was perhaps 7, built slight as late-season wheat, wearing a coat 3 sizes too generous and splitting open at both elbows. She was crouching in the slush between 2 buildings, not quite alley, not quite street, and she was doing something with her hands that made Thomas pull his horse to a stop without consciously choosing to do it. She was dividing a piece of bread. It was not good bread. Even from 30 feet away, he could see the dark bloom of mold along one end. What she held was less a loaf than a remnant, the kind of thing scraped from a donation bin or quietly retrieved from behind a bakehouse before it could be discarded. She separated it the way people separate things they understand cannot be replaced, with absolute focus, with the seriousness of someone performing a sacrament. When the 2 halves were settled, she placed the larger one into the lap of the girl in the wheelchair. Thomas's horse went still beneath him. He had not pulled the reins. The animal simply absorbed the shift in him and responded accordingly. The child in the chair was younger, perhaps 5, perhaps not yet that. Her legs were thin in a particular way, not the thinness of hunger, but of long disuse, of muscles that have given up expecting to be called upon. She sat at an angle in the chair, which sat at an angle in the mud, one wheel half swallowed by a frozen drift. A blanket covered her from the waist down, sodden at the hem. Her face was pale and serious, and she was looking at the bread with the expression of a child who wants something very much and will not, on principle, simply take it. "You keep the big piece," the older girl said. Her voice barely made it to him. Thomas had spent 40 years on open range. His hearing had been sharpened by years of cattle sound and wind. He caught it only because the alley was otherwise silent. "No," the smaller one said. "You keep it. You're the one moving around." "Clara." "Margaret," said the small one, with a formality that did not belong to someone her age. "You didn't eat yesterday either." A pause. Margaret held very still. "I had something earlier," she said. "You didn't." Clara's voice was soft, but carried the particular certainty of someone who has watched someone else too closely to be fooled. Margaret looked at the bread in their hands for a long moment. Then she did something that hit Thomas Arden the way a fence post hits a man who doesn't see it coming in the dark. She tore a small corner from her own half and pressed it quietly onto Clara's portion. Barely anything, a fragment, a gesture, just enough to make the smaller piece fractionally less small. Clara saw it. She said nothing. She reached over and tore the same measure from her own piece and pressed it back. They ate the rest without speaking. Thomas did not move for a long time after that. He sat his horse in the cold and watched two children navigate the mathematics of starvation with the solemn precision and the reciprocal tenderness of two old women who had spent entire lifetimes learning how to share what little they had. When they were done, Margaret leaned forward and wiped a crumb from her sister's chin with the sleeve of her enormous coat. Clara said something too quiet for him to catch. Margaret laughed, brief, real, a small flame in wind, and then the laugh was gone and the cold came back, and they were just two children in a frozen alleyway, in a town that was conducting its business as though they didn't exist. He dismounted. His boots broke through the crust of slush, and both girls went rigid. Margaret stepped in front of the wheelchair immediately, arms out just slightly, not quite blocking it, but placing herself between her sister and the stranger. An instinct so practiced it required no thought. Watching it happen made Thomas's jaw tighten in a way he would have been embarrassed to explain. "We're not causing any trouble," Margaret said. Her chin was level, her voice was controlled. Whatever fear she carried, she had found a shelf for it out of sight. "We're just sitting here." "I can see that," Thomas said. He stopped where he was 20 feet back, hands where she could see them. He had learned, a long time ago, how to stand so a person didn't need to be afraid of him. "Cold spot to choose," he said. "We don't mind it." That was a lie, and both of them knew it. The older girl's lips had gone that particular blue-pink of a child too long in the wind. The younger one's fingers around the wheel rim were white at the knuckles. "Thomas Arden," he said, "just moving through on my way west." Margaret studied him the way a child studies a stranger when she has been taught by hard experience not to read faces at face value, looking for the thing underneath the expression, the intention behind the posture. "West is just as cold," she said. "That's the plain truth," he agreed. A silence, then the small one leaned sideways around her sister's arm. "I'm Clara," she said, with the grave formality of a child who has decided to take the situation in hand. "This is my sister Margaret. We belong here." Thomas looked at the gap between the buildings. "Here." "Not right here," Margaret said, and her voice sharpened slightly at the edges. "Close. Your family know where you are." Something moved across Margaret's face. She controlled it quickly, but not quickly enough. "Our father's gone," she said. "Our mother's resting." "Resting?" She's been sick, Clara said simply, too young to understand which information should be protected. She's been sick a long time. Margaret looks after her, and me. Margaret looks after everybody. Margaret shot her sister a look that translated clearly as hush. Clara returned a look that translated just as clearly as, but it's the truth. Thomas crouched so he wasn't looming, put his hat on his knee. How long has your mother been sick? That's not your business, Margaret said. No, he agreed, it isn't. Another silence. The wind moved through the alley. Clara's chair rocked slightly, and Margaret reached back without looking and steadied it with one hand. Automatic, reflexive, like breathing. There's a doctor in this town, Thomas said. I passed his sign coming in. Fella named Sutton, I think. Dr. Sutton doesn't come to us, Margaret said. The way she said it, flat, factual, without bitterness, without any inflection at all, was somehow harder to hear than anger would have been. He came once when Mama first got bad. He said we owed him for the visit. We didn't have the money. He left and hasn't come back. Thomas looked at her for a moment. How long ago? Margaret pressed her lips together. Her eyes went briefly to Clara. A wordless consultation, the kind that belongs exclusively to siblings who have spent too much time alone together. Maybe 7 weeks, she said. 7 weeks in a Montana winter. Sick woman, 2 children, one of whom couldn't walk. What does your mother have? He asked, keeping his voice level, like it was a simple logistical question with no weight to it. She coughs, Clara offered, at night mostly, and she gets burning hot and then shaking cold, and she can't keep much down anymore. Pneumonia, he'd seen enough of it to know without needing to be told. He had sat with his own grandfather through it in Wyoming when Thomas was not yet 10. He knew precisely what 7 weeks of untreated pneumonia looked like from the inside. Where are you staying? He asked. Margaret watched him for a long moment. He could see her weighing him, measuring him against every adult who had looked at them and found reasons to keep walking. He could see the accumulated weight of that experience in her eyes, which were too still, too careful, too old for the face that held them. The old cooperage, she finally said, at the end of Maple Street, the one that shut down 2 winters back. Nobody uses it. We moved in when Papa died and the bank took the house. Margaret, Clara said quietly. It's fine, Margaret told her. Then to Thomas, we're not doing it for amusement. We had nowhere else to go. I understand that, he said. Don't tell anyone official, Margaret said. The steadiness in her voice cracked, just barely at the outer edges, just enough to let him hear what lived underneath it. If someone official finds out, they'll take Clara somewhere. They don't always keep brothers and sisters together, and she needs. She stopped, cleared her throat. When she spoke again, her voice was sealed. She needs me. Clara reached forward and found her sister's hand. She held it without ceremony. Margaret allowed it. Thomas stood slowly. He put his hat back on. He looked down the alley toward the street where life was moving along, indifferent and purposeful, a cart rolling past, a woman in a good wool coat moving with somewhere to be, 2 men laughing in a doorway with the easy sound of people who have not missed a meal. I'm going to get some supplies, he said. I'd like to bring something by for your mother. There are things that help with a bad cough and a fever. I'm not a doctor, I won't pretend otherwise, but there are things that help. Margaret looked at him hard. Why? It was the right question, the important one, the most important one. Why? Because in this child's understanding, not innocence, she had moved beyond innocence. There was always a motive behind an offer, and the motive was never uncomplicated. Thomas turned the question over honestly. Because I watched you give your sister the larger half, he said. and I watched her give it back. And it seems to me that any family that does that in the middle of whatever you're in the middle of deserves better than what they've got." Clara looked up at him with wide, still eyes. Margaret stared at him for a long moment, then she looked away, her jaw moved once. "You don't have to do that," she said. "We don't take charity." "No," Thomas said. "You need a fair set of circumstances. That's a different thing altogether." A long pause. The wind returned. Margaret pulled her coat tighter with one hand and kept the other wrapped around the handle of Clara's chair. "Second building on the left on Maple Street," she said finally. "The door doesn't sit right. You have to press up while you push inward." "I'll remember," Thomas said. He walked back to his horse. He was aware of their eyes following him as he mounted. He rode out of the alley without looking back, because he thought if he did, he'd see Margaret's face settling back into whatever careful blankness she showed the rest of the world, and he wasn't sure he could stand to watch that particular transformation happen. He went first to the dry goods store. Caleb Marsh ran the place on the corner of Main and 3rd, a man with a broad, wind-reddened face and the specific exhaustion of someone who has learned to make small decisions seem consequential. Thomas laid money on the counter and asked for dried beef stock, preserved meat, a 1/4 pound of ground flour, quinine powder, and a good wool blanket. Marsh glanced at the list, glanced at Thomas. "Staying in town a spell. 1 night, maybe 2. Passing through to where?" "West." Marsh began pulling items from behind the counter with a deliberate casualness. "Coming off the North Road?" he asked. "Just road." "There's a family." Marsh set the preserved meat on the counter. His voice had a particular quality to it, not quite gossip, something more considered than that, something measuring. "Hale family, used to have property east of town. Father died a few months back. The mother took sick after. They're in a hard situation." "That's so," Thomas said. "Town did what it could at the start," Marsh said. He was watching Thomas's face. "Food on the doorstep, that sort of thing, but there's only so much to be done when a family runs into sustained bad luck." "Bad luck," Thomas repeated. "Some folks say there's something cursed about that property since the father died." Marsh stacked the items. "Children still in that family. The oldest girl maybe 8, another one younger with something wrong with her legs." He paused, as though the detail cost him something. "Langley's had his eye on that land for a while, Dixon Langley." Thomas looked at him. It came out flat, not a question. Marsh went very still. "You know him?" "I know the type," Thomas said. He counted exact money onto the counter, began loading his saddlebag. He was at the door when Marsh spoke again, low and careful. "You said you're just moving through." Thomas stopped, didn't turn. "Men who say that," Marsh said, "usually do." "Usually," Thomas agreed. He walked out. By the time he reached Maple Street, the sky had taken on that brief, doomed gold that Montana produces in late winter, the light that tries to be beautiful for 20 minutes before the dark extinguishes it. He found the second building on the left, low with a board nailed across the front window, the door sitting slightly wrong in its frame. He pressed up while pushing inward, the way she'd said, and the door groaned open into cold air and something beneath it, old timber, years of dry-stored goods still in the walls, and underneath all of it the warm, sour smell of illness that he recognized immediately and hated recognizing. A boy materialized from the shadows almost before Thomas's eyes had adjusted. 14, perhaps, dark-haired, hard-eyed, standing with his feet wide apart in the way boys stand when they have been practicing being men for too long and with too many genuine reasons. "Who are you?" Not quite a question. a statement with a question mark attached as an afterthought. Thomas Arden, Margaret said I could come. From somewhere deeper in the building, Margaret's voice, Daniel, it's all right, let him in. The boy Daniel, the oldest, Thomas noted, examined him with the specific male scrutiny of someone who has been the nearest thing to a man of the house for several months and has developed very precise opinions about what that means. Then he stepped aside. Barely enough. Thomas stepped in. He kept his expression level as his eyes adjusted. He kept his breathing even. He had made himself a quiet promise on the way over, don't react. The children were watching, and children who have survived prolonged difficulty become expert readers of adult faces. They look for the signal that tells them how bad it truly is. He had spent 4 decades on frontier land. He had seen hard winters. He had seen what sustained poverty does to a structure, to a body, to a family over the long course of time. But he had not been inside a space like this one since he was 9 years old, watching his grandfather struggle to stay in the world. The woman on the floor was not old. She might have been 32, 34. Illness had stripped away whatever distinction that made, reducing her to the clean bare geography of a face fighting very hard to remain here. She lay on a folded blanket that had been arranged to provide maximum insulation between her body and the cold floor. Her breathing was audible from across the room, wet, labored, the sound of lungs that had been losing the argument for a long time. Beside her sat a boy of perhaps 10, with his mother's coloring and eyes that were swollen from recent crying. He was working hard not to resume. He held her hand in both of his and didn't look up when Thomas came in. Margaret was standing near the far wall. Clara was beside her in the wheelchair, wrapped in what appeared to be every piece of fabric available, a mosaic of blankets, coats, and what looked like curtain material sewn around her shoulders. She watched Thomas with large, steady eyes, the eyes of a child who has had to cultivate patience much earlier than childhood ought to require. This is Owen, Margaret said, nodding toward the boy beside his mother. And that's Mama. She said it plainly, no apology, no elaboration. She doesn't always know what's around her, she added, but she knows our voices. Thomas set his saddlebag down carefully. He crouched beside the woman and held the back of his hand near her face without making contact. The heat radiating off her was wrong, excessive, sustained, the fever of a body that has been in extended conflict with itself. Daniel, he said quietly without looking up, there's a pot in my bag. Is there a fire going anywhere in this building? Back room, Daniel said, cautious. Can you make it bigger? A pause, the boy measuring risk against necessity. Yes. Then do that and fill the pot with whatever clean water you have. Daniel didn't move immediately. What are you doing? Thomas looked up at him. He met the boy's eyes straight, the way he'd learned to look at people who needed to understand they were being taken seriously before they'd extend any trust. I'm going to make a broth. The quinine I brought will help with the fever. The broth will help her keep something in her. I've been around pneumonia enough to know what helps and what doesn't. He paused. I won't promise you she comes through this. I'm not a man who makes promises about things he can't guarantee, but she's got a better chance with this than without it, and right now a better chance is what I have to offer. Daniel looked at him for another moment. Then he crossed to the saddlebag, found the pot, and went to the back room. Clara's voice came from the wheelchair, clear and calm. Are you going to stay tonight? Tonight, Thomas said. And tomorrow. He looked at the girl. She was watching him with those large, unhurried eyes, and what struck him, what he would think about for a long time afterward, was not the absence of fear, because she understood her situation with total clarity. It was what had come through on the other side of that fear. something that in an adult would have been called faith, and in a 5-year-old was simply the decision not to close the door. "Tomorrow I'll determine tomorrow," he said honestly. Clara nodded, like that was the correct answer. Margaret stood against the wall and watched him and said nothing at all. Later, much later, after the broth had been coaxed slowly into the woman's body by Margaret's patient, steady hands, after Daniel had stopped stationing himself between Thomas and everything else long enough to eat a full portion of preserved beef without apology, after Owen had cried for about 5 minutes and then stopped and fallen asleep holding his mother's wrist, after Clara had been lifted into a more comfortable position and covered with the new wool blanket and fallen asleep almost immediately with a small sound of relief at the warmth, Thomas Arden sat with his back against the wall near the door. Margaret came and sat beside him. Not close, a considered distance, but beside him. "People in this town saw us," she said, low voice so as not to wake anyone, "for weeks. Some of them were friends with our parents' friends." "I know," Thomas said. "They stopped coming, one by one. Mr. Marsh told my father once that he'd help if things ever went hard. He said it. I heard him with my own ears." She pulled her knees to her chest inside the oversized coat. "He brought 1 sack of flour the week after Papa died, nothing since." "People get frightened," Thomas said carefully. "Of what?" "Of bad luck they think might be contagious, of looking at suffering long enough that they're forced to decide what kind of person they are." He paused. "Most people would rather not have to decide that." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Are you afraid of it?" she asked. "The bad luck?" "No," he looked at his hands. "I've had plenty of my own, doesn't seem to spread." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. "There's something else," she said, "about why people stopped coming." She was staring forward. "There's a man named Dixon Langley. He owns most of what's worth owning around here. Since Papa died, he's been doing things, legal things, papers, saying we owe money, saying the property wasn't Papa's in the right way." She pressed her lips together. "Our house has been empty 2 months now. Langley has a lock on the door, says there's a debt against it." She stopped. Her hands, wrapped around her knees, were trembling slightly. "But Papa told me before he died. He sat with me and he said, 'Margaret, the land is yours.' He said it. He said there were papers that proved it. He said he kept them somewhere safe." Her voice dropped. "He died before he could tell me where." Thomas said nothing immediately. Something in him had become very quiet and very focused. "Your father's death," he said carefully. "What does the town say about it?" Margaret turned and looked at him directly for the first time since sitting down. Her eyes in the dim firelight from the back room were dark and absolutely steady. "They say it was an accident," she said. A pause. "And what do you say?" Thomas asked. Margaret Hale, 7 years old, sitting in a cold and abandoned building in one of the worst winters anyone in Caldwell Fork could remember, surrounded by her sick mother and her sleeping brothers and her sister in a broken wheelchair, looked at Thomas Arden with the eyes of someone who had already worked out the answer and was simply waiting for the world to arrive at the same place. "I say," she said slowly, "that my papa was a careful man. He checked everything. He always checked everything at least twice. He said once that a careless mistake is really just a lazy decision you made earlier in the day." She looked away. "That's what I say." Thomas looked at the far wall for a long moment. "All right," he said quietly. "All right what?" He was quiet for a beat longer. Then, "All right, I'm staying tomorrow as well." Margaret didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was measured and controlled, giving him nothing for free. "Why?" The same question as before. the only question that mattered. He thought again about honesty and what it costs a person. "Because your father checked everything twice," he said, "and I want to know what he was checking." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked away. She didn't say anything else that night. But she didn't move away from where she was sitting either. And that, Thomas was beginning to understand, was as close to trust as this particular child knew how to come, sitting near someone, just near enough, without quite permitting herself to believe they were going to stay. Outside, the wind had strengthened and the snow was returning, falling in slow, thick curtains across the dark streets of Caldwell Fork, Montana, covering everything with democratic indifference. The warm houses and the cold ones, the full tables and the bare floors, the people who had chosen to look elsewhere and the ones who had not yet made up their minds. And inside the abandoned cooperage on Maple Street, a family breathed together in the dark, and for the first time in a very long time, there was something else in the room alongside them. Not safety, not yet, but the shape that safety makes when it is still deciding whether it has been invited. Thomas Arden did not sleep that night. He sat with his back against the wall and listened to the woman breathe, counting the seconds between each labored, wet inhalation, the way you count the seconds between lightning and thunder when you're trying to measure how close the danger actually is. Every time her breathing shifted, Margaret's eyes opened in the dark across the room. The girl wasn't sleeping. She was lying on her side with one arm looped around the base of Clara's wheelchair, and every time her mother's rhythm changed, she went rigid for a moment and then slowly released. She had been doing it so long she did it in her sleep. When the first grey light came through the cracks in the boarded window, Thomas got up, built the back room fire higher, and set water on. Daniel appeared in the doorway minutes later, hair pressed flat on one side, watching with those careful, hard eyes. "You stayed. Said I would." Daniel leaned against the doorframe. Men say plenty of things. "True enough," Thomas agreed. He stirred the quinine into a tin cup of hot water, slow and even. "Your mother needs more of this before she's fully awake. You know how to get her to drink when she's not all the way conscious." "I know how," said Margaret from behind her brother. She stepped past Daniel without ceremony, took the cup, and went to kneel beside her mother. Thomas watched her tip the cup with a patience no 7-year-old should need to have, murmuring low and constant, "Mama, just a little, just a small sip, come on now," until the woman's throat moved, once, twice. "Good," Emily said softly, "good, Mama." Daniel was watching his little sister with an expression he locked down the moment he noticed Thomas looking. He crossed his arms and stared at the floor. "She's been doing that for 7 weeks, he said. It came out rougher than he meant it to. Every morning, every night, figuring out what Mama needs before anyone else says a word." "I can see that," Thomas said. "She's 7 years old." Daniel's jaw tightened. He gestured vaguely at the room, at all of it. "She should be worried about, I don't know, something that isn't this." "She shouldn't," Thomas said. "You're right about that." From the other room, Clara's voice, "Is there anything to eat?" Margaret's voice immediately, "Not yet, but there will be, all right." A pause. "Is Thomas still here?" A longer pause from Margaret, then quietly, "Yes." "I knew he would be," Clara said. Thomas looked at Daniel. Daniel was still studying the floor. After a moment he said, without looking up, "She told Clara last night she thought you'd be gone by morning, that you seemed decent, but that decent men always moved on eventually." He turned his hat in his hands, a nervous gesture, Thomas noticed. "She told Clara that expecting anything else was how you ended up hurt." "I imagine that's been the lesson," Thomas said. Daniel looked at him then. What makes you different? The same question Margaret had asked twice the day before, wearing different clothes. Thomas understood it wasn't really a question. It was a test, and the test was not about the answer. It was about whether a man flinched when the question was asked. He didn't flinch. Nothing, maybe, he said. We'll see. That was enough for Daniel, not because it satisfied him, but because it was honest, and honesty, even unwelcome honesty, was something he could orient himself to. He unfolded his arms and came to crouch by the fire. Thomas let a moment pass, then, conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Your father's coat, the one he was wearing when he died, do you still have it? Daniel went still, not the stillness of suspicion, the stillness of grief, the way a person's body stops when something unexpected puts its hand precisely on a wound they've been walking carefully around for months. Yes, Daniel said, Margaret kept it. Where's? Daniel looked sideways at him. Why? Your sister told me something last night, Thomas said, about papers, about your father saying the land was documented, that he kept the proof somewhere safe. He kept his voice level, matter of fact. I don't want to go through your father's things without asking first, but if something's in that coat, I'd like to see it. Daniel stared at the fire. His hands, extended toward the heat, had gone rigid. He said that to Margaret, he said slowly, about papers, about the land being hers. She told me. A silence that had a particular weight to it. Daniel was working through it. Thomas could see the calculations moving behind his eyes, the geometry of what it might mean, everything a 14-year-old who has been the adult of a desperate household for months would understand about land and documentation and men like Dixon Langley. It's in the corner, Daniel said finally, under the blankets against the south wall, brown coat with a missing button. Thomas stood. The coat was where Daniel had said, folded with the careful flat precision of someone who cannot afford to lose what it represents and cannot bring themselves to look at it. Brown wool, heavy, one pocket partially torn away, one button missing on the chest. Thomas picked it up and felt the weight of it and understood immediately how it had been kept, and he handled it accordingly. He ran his hands along the inside carefully, along the bottom hem, along the collar. Then his fingers found it, a stiffness in the lining between the outer fabric and the inner layer near the left side seam, a thickness that wasn't padding. He turned the coat and examined the seam. Someone had resewn it, recently, not neatly, a man's stitching, done quickly, done with specific intention. Daniel, Thomas said quietly, do you have a knife? The boy drew one from his boot without hesitation and extended it handle first. Thomas ran the blade carefully along the inside of the seam and reached into the gap. His fingers found paper, several sheets, folded multiple times, stiff with handling, pressed flat against the lining. He drew them out. Margaret appeared in the doorway. Of course she had heard. She came in and stood beside Daniel, and both of them watched as Thomas unfolded the documents on his knee and read. He read slowly, making certain he understood what he was looking at before he said anything. When he looked up, his face was very composed. Both of you need to hear this, he said. Margaret sat, Daniel crouched. From the other room, Clara's voice, what is it? What did you find? Nothing yet, Margaret called back. That's not true, Clara said, with the impeccable accuracy of a 5-year-old who was paying close attention to everything. Thomas smoothed the papers flat on his knee. These are title deeds, he said, for the farmland your family worked, for the east pasture, and for the mineral rights beneath both parcels, all registered in your father's name, all properly recorded with the county in, he checked the date, 1882, 8 years ago. Daniel exhaled. Margaret said nothing. Mineral rights, Daniel said slowly, that means whatever's beneath that ground belongs to whoever holds these papers, Thomas said. And approximately 9 months ago, there was a geological survey conducted in this county, testing for oil deposits. He watched their faces. Do you understand what that means for that land? Margaret's voice was perfectly level. It means the land is worth a great deal more than anyone told us. Considerably more, Thomas said. The silence that followed filled immediately with everything that hadn't yet been said aloud. Daniel's face moved through several things and arrived at something cold and very focused. Margaret was entirely still. Then she said quietly, "That's why he died." It was not a question. She had known the shape of this answer for months, had been circling it, waiting for someone to put words to it that she was too young to say for herself. Thomas held her gaze. He was not going to soften it. He was not going to coat it in perhaps, and we can't be certain, and let's not jump to conclusions, because she was owed the truth, and she was strong enough to carry it. That's why he died, he said. Daniel stood up fast. He put his back to the room, hands at his sides, shoulders rigid. He made no sound, but his entire body was doing something it needed a private moment to do. Thomas and Margaret both looked away and gave him that moment. When Daniel turned back, his face had been reset, raw at the edges, but reset. "Langley," he said. "I'd need proof before I say that name in this town," Thomas said carefully, "but these papers, these tell us what your father knew and what someone needed him not to share. They're the beginning of proof." He refolded the documents. "I need to keep these safe. Somewhere Langley's people can't reach them if they come looking." "They've already come," Margaret said. Thomas looked at her. "Twice," she said, matter of fact. "Men in good coats. They knocked and told Daniel there were debts against the property and we needed to vacate. Daniel told them Mama was too sick to move." She paused. "They said they'd return with the sheriff." "When?" She glanced at Daniel. 10 days ago." Thomas stood. He put the folded documents inside his own coat, close to his body. "Then we don't have much time to be deliberate about this." "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked. "First, the county courthouse. The records will have the survey results, and if Langley's been filing anything against your father's property, it'll be there. I want to know exactly what he's constructed and where it's vulnerable." He looked at Daniel. "Second, you don't open that door for anyone while I'm gone. Anyone, understood?" Daniel nodded, once sharp. "Third," Thomas looked at Margaret. "Is there anyone in this town, one person, that your parents trusted, someone who might still have some?" "Mrs. Calloway," Margaret said without hesitation. "Elena Calloway, she taught here 6 years. She used to bring food those first weeks." She stopped before she stopped. "Why did she stop?" Margaret's mouth pressed flat. "Same reason everyone stopped. Langley owns the mill. He owns 2 of the 3 big farms east of town. He holds the note on the boarding house. You work against Langley, you work against your own livelihood." She said livelihood the way a child says a word heard from adults, carefully, like borrowed clothes that nearly fit. "Mrs. Calloway's husband works at the mill." "But she came before." "She's a decent woman," Margaret said simply. "She just got scared." "Then she's exactly the right kind of scared person to speak to," Thomas said. He pulled on his coat. Daniel moved toward the door ahead of him, which Thomas noted without comment. The boy was going to check the street first, had probably been doing it for weeks. "Clear," Daniel said. Obliged. Thomas moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. He looked at Margaret, standing in the center of the room, arms folded inside her enormous coat, watching him with that expression she maintained, guarded, contained, conceding nothing for free. "I'll be back before dark," he said. "You weren't here yesterday," she said. "No," he agreed, "I wasn't, but I'm saying it today, which is the day that matters." She looked at him for a moment, then she looked away. Which was, Thomas was learning, her particular way of saying fine, then go. He went. The county courthouse was a squat two-story building on the north end of Main Street, sandstone and territorial brick, the kind of construction meant to project authority and permanence, and which mostly projected that someone had spent the minimum necessary to avoid embarrassment. Thomas had been inside buildings like this across the territory. He knew how they operated, who sat where, what got recorded and what got misplaced, which drawers locked for legitimate reasons and which ones stuck for other kinds. The county clerk was a slight man named Drury, who had the look of someone who had spent his career watching powerful men do things he didn't like, and had made his peace with it by becoming essentially invisible. He found Thomas's questions mildly alarming, and Thomas's money immediately reassuring. What Thomas assembled from the county records took him 40 minutes. When he had it assembled, he sat back in the hard chair across from Drury's desk and thought about it carefully. The survey was there, March 1882, commissioned by a company out of Helena that anyone with any curiosity could link to Langley in approximately 2 steps. The results indicated significant oil-bearing shale beneath the eastern parcels of the county, with the Hale property sitting directly above the most concentrated deposit. Also there, a debt claim against the Hale property filed 5 weeks after Robert Hale's death, signed by a bank Thomas had never heard of, whose listed address appeared, on closer examination, to belong to a building that existed primarily on paper. Also there, filed the same week as the debt claim, a work order from the construction company that had employed Robert Hale in his final months, stamped as complete, knotting the worksite where Hale had died. At the bottom, in handwriting that didn't match the printed header, see supplemental, Langley D. Drury was watching Thomas read. When Thomas set the papers down, Drury said, very quietly and without quite meeting his eyes, "Those supplemental files, the ones referenced at the bottom of that order." "Yes." "They were removed from the record approximately 5 months ago," Drury said, "for what the request described as a routine administrative audit." "Who authorized the removal?" "The request came through the sheriff's office," Drury said. He straightened a stack of papers on his desk. "Though the sheriff doesn't typically authorize record removals, that would normally fall to Langley's attorney, a man named Ferris." He straightened another stack. He was looking at his desk with the focused attention of a man who is carefully not saying something and is fully aware of not saying it. Ferris keeps an office on 3rd Street above the feed merchant. Thomas folded his notes. "I'm grateful for your help." "I haven't helped anyone," Drury said to his desk. "No," Thomas agreed, "you haven't." He left the courthouse and stood on the step in the cold and thought about how much of this had already been organized by people who'd had months to arrange it. The debt claim was fabricated but on record. The supplemental files were gone. The sheriff was at minimum compromised. Langley had spent months constructing a legal architecture around the Hale family, as airtight as a sealed room, somewhere a family could slowly run out of air while the instruments of the law looked on and offered nothing. What Langley had not accounted for was documents sewn into a dead man's coat. Thomas turned up his collar and walked toward 3rd Street. He was halfway there when a man fell into step beside him. Not aggressively, just a large man in an expensive coat appearing at his left elbow with the practiced ease of someone who does this professionally. Mr. Arden, the voice was pleasant, educated, carrying the particular accent of money that has been comfortable long enough to stop noticing itself. Mr. Langley would like to invite you for a drink. Thomas kept walking. I'm selective about who I drink with. Mr. Langley suspected you might be. The man kept pace without effort. He was bigger than Thomas and younger, and carried his size with the relaxed confidence of someone who rarely needs to deploy it because people can see it's available. He also thought you might appreciate knowing that Caldwell Fork is a small town. A man's activities here tend to become widely known quickly. Mr. Langley is generous to people who understand how things operate. I understand how things operate, Thomas said. That's generally the difficulty people find with me. The man was quiet for half a block. The Hale family, he said. I understand you paid them a visit last night. Thomas stopped walking. The man stopped too, one step ahead, and turned. Up close, his face was professional rather than cruel, simply empty of any particular investment in how things came out, the way hired men's faces often are. They're in a difficult position, the man said. Debts, a sick mother, young children. He said it wearing the shape of sympathy without any of the substance. Mr. Langley has been attempting to find a resolution for their situation. If the property transferred cleanly, the children would receive a settlement, enough to see to the mother's care, enough for a fresh start somewhere more manageable. Thomas looked at the man for a long moment. The younger girl, he said, the one who can't walk, where does she go in this fresh start? The man's expression didn't shift. Arrangements would be made. Arrangements? Thomas said the word the way you set something decomposing onto a table and step back from it. How much is Langley offering? Enough, the man said. You understand what enough means to people who have nothing, Thomas said. It means they can't distinguish between it and whatever's put in front of them. That's what you're counting on. The man watched him without expression. What are you counting on, Mr. Arden? Thomas thought about a little girl in a frozen alley breaking a piece of bread in half with the gravity of someone performing something sacred. He thought about her sister pressing the larger piece back. He thought about documents sewn into a dead man's coat by a father who knew what was coming and refused to let it be the final word for his children. I'm counting, Thomas said, on the truth being harder to erase than Mr. Langley believes. He walked away. The man didn't follow, but Thomas knew, with the certainty of a man who has watched this particular machinery before, that within the hour Langley would know exactly what had been said, and within the day Langley would know about the courthouse visit, and the moment Langley knew that, the clock above the Hale family would begin running faster. Thomas walked faster too. He needed to reach Elena Calloway before the news did. He found her on Birchwood Street, taking laundry down from a line strung between her porch post and the fence. Working quickly against the cold with the efficient automatism of a woman who does everything efficiently because there isn't time for it to be otherwise. She was perhaps 50, with dark, attentive eyes and a face that had once been very open and had learned over time to be more guarded about that. She saw him coming, and her hands went still on the clothesline. I don't know who you are, she said before he was close enough for ordinary conversation. Thomas Arden, I've been with the Hale family since last night. Her hands stayed still. Her expression moved through several things and arrived at a complicated kind of pain that she was working to contain. How are they? It wasn't quite a question. It was someone who already knew the answer and needed to hear it said aloud. "The mother is still alive," Thomas said. "Barely. The children are extraordinary, Mrs. Calloway, particularly the oldest girl." Something in Alina Calloway's face broke and rebuilt itself so quickly that if Thomas hadn't been watching for it, he'd have missed it entirely. "Margaret," she said, yes, extraordinary is the word. "She mentioned you," Thomas said you were a decent woman." Alina Calloway closed her eyes briefly. "I stopped going," she said. 5 months ago I stopped." She opened her eyes. "My husband works for Langley's mill." "I know," Thomas said. "Then you understand why." "I understand why people stop," he said. "I'm asking whether you have reasons to start again." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved the wet laundry on the line, and she didn't reach for it. "What do you need?" she asked. "I need someone this town believes to know what I know," Thomas said. "Because what I found in that courthouse, Mrs. Calloway, Robert Hale did not die in an accident. His family has documents that prove what was done to them. And in the next day or two, Dixon Langley is going to move to ensure those documents never reach a courtroom." Alina Calloway's face had gone very still. "You understand what I'm telling you," Thomas said. "I understand," she said. Her voice was low and taut. "I've understood for months. She stopped. She looked at the laundry on the line as though it might offer some answer. Then she looked back at him. "Tell me," she said, "everything." Thomas told her. By the time he finished, the laundry was stiff with cold on the line, and Alina Calloway was no longer a woman who was afraid. She was a woman who had been handed the thing she had been missing for 5 months, not courage, because she'd had that all along, but somewhere for courage to go. "There are others," she said quietly, "people in this town who know what Langley is, who have seen it and said nothing because one person standing alone is easy to remove. But several people," Thomas said, "standing together and prepared before he makes his move, that's harder to bury." She nodded, slow and certain. "There's a man named Beckett," she said. "He worked the same site as Robert Hale. He saw something that day that he hasn't been able to stop drinking about since." Thomas straightened. "Where is he?" "Above the livery stable on the south end of town," Alina said. "He won't speak to a stranger, but he'll speak to me." "Then speak to him tonight," Thomas said. "Tell him I have the deeds. Tell him the mineral rights are fully documented. Tell him Robert Hale made absolutely certain his children could prove every word of it." He paused. "Tell him the man who saw something that day has a chance to stop living inside it." Alina Calloway nodded once. Then she turned and went inside without another word, leaving the laundry on the line. Thomas stood on the empty street and looked up at the sky, which was doing what Montana skis do in late winter, assembling something large and gray over the northern mountains, the kind of sky that means the weather isn't done with anyone yet. He needed to get back to the children before dark. He needed to think about where to keep the documents and what Langley's next move would be and how much time remained before it came. But walking back toward Maple Street with the deeds pressed against his chest and the cold at his back, he was thinking mostly about a little girl who had told him her father checked everything twice, because that man, careful and deliberate and knowing what was coming for him, had made sure his children would have what they needed. Thomas wasn't certain he was the right person to have found them. But he was here, and tonight, in this town, here was going to have to be sufficient. Thomas was 2 blocks from Maple Street when he heard the horse. Not moving quickly, that was what caught his attention. A horse moving slow and deliberate in the dark, the way a horse moves when its rider wants it quiet. He stepped into the gap between the ironmonger and the grain merchant without breaking stride, pressed his back against the wall, and waited. Two riders, good coats, the same broad-shouldered man from that afternoon, and a second Thomas hadn't seen before, shorter, with a rifle laid across his saddle. They passed the end of the alley without looking sideways, heading south on Maple Street. Toward the cooperage. Thomas moved. He came out of the alley fast and cut through the passage behind the grain merchant, cleared a low fence with more ease than 63 years had any right to produce, and came around behind the building that backed onto the cooperage just as the two riders were dismounting at the front. He heard the knock before he reached the rear door, 3 sharp raps, official, the kind of knock designed to sound like authority. He heard Daniel's voice through the wall, "We're not opening that door." A pleasant voice outside, "Son, we have a legal order. You can cooperate or make this difficult, but the result is the same either way." Thomas came through the back without knocking. Daniel spun, knife already in hand, and then recognized him and let out a breath that was equal parts relief and contained fury. "They're at the front." "I know." Thomas crossed to the interior wall and looked at Margaret. She was standing beside Clara's wheelchair with both hands on the handles, her face white and absolutely still, like carved marble. Owen was pressed against the far wall, gripping his mother's blanket with both hands. The woman on the floor was still breathing. He could hear it, that same labored rhythm, but something in it had deepened, slowed. "Margaret," Thomas said quietly, "take Clara to the back room. Take Owen with you." "I'm not leaving Mama," Margaret said. "You're keeping your sister safe," Thomas said. "That's not the same thing." Outside, the knock came again, louder. "Open this door, or we'll open it ourselves." "Daniel," Thomas looked at the boy. "Don't open it, don't respond." He waited until Daniel steered Margaret and the wheelchair toward the back room, until he heard Owen's footsteps following. Then he positioned himself near the front door in the dark and spoke loudly enough to carry through the wood. "There is a woman dying in this building," he said. "If you need to conduct your legal business, come back tomorrow morning with the sheriff present and documents I can review in daylight. Tonight, you're leaving." Silence outside. Then the broad man's voice, something new in it, a calculation, not anger. "And who exactly are you?" "Thomas Arden. I've been in this town 48 hours. In that time, I've visited the county courthouse, reviewed approximately 30 years of property records, and had the pleasure of a conversation with one of Mr. Langley's associates this afternoon, who explained at some length how generous Mr. Langley is to people who cooperate." Thomas paused. "Go back to Langley and tell him that what Robert Hale sewed into his coat lining is no longer in that coat. Tell him that, and let him decide what to do with the information." A long silence. Then the sound of boots on frozen ground moving away, saddle leather creaking, hooves beginning slow, then accelerating northward. Thomas stood in the dark and breathed. Daniel appeared in the doorway. "What just happened?" "We bought time," Thomas said. "Not much. Come here, I need to speak with you and Margaret together." They gathered in the back room around the fire. Daniel, Margaret with her hand on Clara's wheelchair. Owen, sitting close enough to the flames that Thomas wanted to tell him to move back. Thomas looked at each of them in turn, and then said what needed saying, plainly and directly. "Langley knows I found the documents. He's going to move faster now. Tonight or tomorrow morning he'll try again, and next time it won't be 2 men asking politely." He looked at Daniel. "I need you to understand what we're dealing with. This is not a debt dispute. This is a man who arranged your father's death because he wanted your land, and who has spent 6 months ensuring the law in this town looks away while he operates. Owen made a sound, one short, involuntary sound, and pressed his fist to his mouth. Daniel said nothing. His face became what it became when it needed to be functional. Margaret said, "What do we do?" "Mrs. Calloway is speaking with Beckett tonight. He worked with your father. He saw something the day your father died, and he's going to tell her what it was." "Will he," Daniel said, "actually tell her?" "She's the right person to ask him." Thomas put his hands on his knees. "In the meantime, your mother needs a doctor, not tomorrow morning, tonight." Margaret looked at him. "I told you, Sutton won't come." "He will," Thomas said, "if someone gives him a reason that outweighs his reasons not to." "What reason?" Daniel asked. "Let me worry about that. You keep this door from opening for anyone but me or Mrs. Calloway." He looked at Margaret. "How has she been this past hour?" Margaret's jaw worked once. "Worse," she said. Her breathing changed. "I heard it." He stood. "I'll be back." He went out the back and moved quickly. Dr. Sutton lived above his office on 5th Street, a two-story arrangement that communicated precisely how the man felt about the boundary between professional and personal life. Thomas went to the front door and knocked steadily until a light moved behind the upstairs window and the sash opened, and a face appeared, irritable and soft with interrupted sleep. "Office hours are." "I know your hours," Thomas said. "I need you to come with me now. I'll pay double your rate, cash tonight." A pause, the professional calculation of a man who values sleep and money in roughly equal measure. "Who's the patient?" "Anna Hale, Maple Street." The window came down fast. Thomas stood and waited. He was calculating what other leverage he had when the downstairs light appeared and the door opened. Sutton was perhaps 55, with a precise grey beard and the specific disappointed expression of a man who has spent his career being asked to care about people he's decided aren't worth caring about. He looked at Thomas. "The Hale woman." "Yes. I was there 6 weeks ago. I told them." "I know what you told them," Thomas said. "I'm telling you something different. Come." He didn't wait for agreement. He walked, and after a moment Thomas didn't observe because he wasn't watching. Sutton followed. They were a block from Maple Street when Sutton said, breathing harder than the pace warranted, "She won't have lasted 6 weeks of untreated." "She's still alive," Thomas said. "You might consider what that tells you about what those children have been doing to keep her that way." Sutton said nothing. Margaret opened the door before Thomas knocked. She'd heard them coming. She looked at Sutton with an expression that held contempt and desperate relief in the same space and stepped back to let them in. Sutton knelt beside Anna Hale and did what doctors do, and Thomas watched his face change as he worked, the professional distance cracking at the edges, the slight tightening around the eyes that meant the situation was exactly what Thomas had said it was. "She needs more quinine than this," Sutton said, "and steam. Her lungs need sustained moisture." "We have one pot," Margaret said. "We've had no way to make steam." "That pot is what we'll use," Sutton said. He was already reaching into his bag. His voice had changed, not warm, but present in a way it hadn't been at his front door. "Someone needs to keep water boiling through the night without interruption." "I'll do it," Owen said immediately. He was on his feet, red-eyed and absolutely certain. "Tell me exactly how I can do this." Sutton told him. Owen listened with the focused attention of a 10-year-old who has found something concrete to contribute in the middle of helplessness, and went to the back room without another word. Thomas crouched beside Sutton while the doctor worked. "I need to ask you something," he said low, "about Robert Hale's accident." Sutton's hands slowed, just slightly. I was called to the worksite, Sutton said. He kept his eyes on his work. To certify cause of death. What did you certify? A pause, accidental structural failure, consistent with a collapse at height. Was it consistent? A longer pause. There were injuries, Sutton said carefully, that a structural collapse would not typically. He stopped. His hand moved again, faster, as though he could outrun the sentence he'd started. I recorded what I was asked to record. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Who asked you? Sutton didn't answer. Ferris, Thomas said, Langley's attorney. Sutton set down the instrument in his hand and pressed both palms flat against his knees. He was breathing through his nose, controlled and deliberate. I have a practice here, he said. I have a family. Langley holds the mortgage on my building. I understand that, Thomas said, not forgiving it, simply acknowledging it as fact. I'm not asking you to be something you aren't. I'm asking you to tell me right now what you know. Because by tomorrow morning, what Langley holds may not matter. I have documents going to the county seat at first light. And when this comes to light, the men who stayed quiet are going to be asked to account for themselves to people with considerably more authority than Dixon Langley. Sutton stared at the woman on the floor. He stared for a long time. Then he looked up and found Margaret, who was standing in the doorway watching him with those old, still eyes. He looked away quickly. The injuries, he said very quietly, were consistent with a man who fell from height under his own weight, not with a man who was buried by falling timber. He said it to the floor. A falling beam leaves a different pattern. The angle of impact is different. Robert Hale's injuries indicated he went over the third-level railing. He paused, or was sent over it. There was a witness, Thomas said. Beckett, he was on that site. Sutton's voice went thin. Beckett was the one who carried Hale's body out. He was also the first one to say it was an accident before anyone else arrived. He swallowed. I assumed he was telling the truth, or I assumed he was saying what he'd been instructed to say, and I was relieved because it made it easier. The fire in the back room crackled. Owen's footsteps moved steadily back and forth. Anna Hale breathed her slow, difficult breath. Margaret came into the room and sat beside her mother and took her hand in both of hers. She didn't look at Sutton. She didn't look at Thomas. She just sat there, 7 years old, holding her mother's hand, and she was the oldest person in the room. Then Clara's voice came from the back, sharp and sudden. Someone's outside. Thomas was moving before the last word was finished. He went to the back room. Clara was in her wheelchair by the wall, turned toward the boarded window, head tilted with the focused attention of someone listening very hard. How many? More than 2, Clara said, with the same calm that was simply her nature, the calm that comes from having passed through the far side of fear and arrived somewhere quieter. I can hear movement on both sides. Thomas looked at Daniel, who was already at the back door with the knife pressed flat against the wall. The front too, Daniel said. I hear boots. 3 sides, not 2 men asking politely. Thomas had told Langley's man about the documents, and Langley had responded the way men like Langley respond when their careful constructions are threatened, not with patience, but with force, deployed fast and without the formality of tomorrow morning. Thomas pulled the documents from inside his coat and looked around the room. Owen stared at him with wide eyes. Clara watched steadily from her chair. Clara, Thomas said, can you hold something under your blanket and not let anyone take it from you? Clara's chin came up. Try me, she said. He put the folded documents in her hands. Her fingers closed around them immediately, small and sure, and she tucked them beneath the layers of blankets with a deftness that almost made him smile. Nobody's going to look there, Clara said. No, Thomas agreed, they aren't. From out front, a knock, louder this time, with more men behind it, the sound of something that had given up asking. Then a voice Thomas hadn't heard before, older, tired. Arden, this is Sheriff Connell. I have a court order requiring the Hale property to vacate. Open this door. Thomas went to the front. He stood close to the door. Sheriff Anna Hale cannot be moved. Her doctor is present and will confirm the same. Moving her tonight is a death sentence. A pause, then Connell's voice, lower, something in it that was not entirely the voice of a man at ease with what he was doing. Dr. Sutton. Sutton appeared beside Thomas. He looked at the door. He looked at Thomas. The moment held. Thomas said nothing. He didn't push. He didn't prompt. Some things a man has to reach himself or not at all. Sutton turned toward the door and raised his voice. This patient cannot safely be transporting. I won't certify a transfer tonight. Anyone who moves her does so against explicit medical advice and assumes full responsibility for what follows. Another pause outside, longer, then Connell's voice, low, not meant for Thomas, to someone else. Langley, I cannot move a bedridden. And another voice, smooth, measured, carrying the specific authority of a man who has never been told no long enough to take it seriously. That family is squatting on my client's legally documented property. The court order is valid. Your job is to enforce it. Langley was there himself. Thomas hadn't expected that. He recalibrated quickly. Langley's personal presence meant the man felt the situation had moved beyond what he could manage at a distance. He was here because the documents being found had rattled him. He wanted to see it done. He needed to be certain. Which meant he was afraid. No, Thomas put his back against the wall beside the door. You know what's in those property records you've known for months. You countersigned Ferris's removal request because Langley asked you to. I know that because Drury told me not directly. Drury's careful, but enough. He paused. Whatever Langley has promised you, it won't hold once this is in front of a territorial judge. And it will be in front of a territorial judge. First light, if I have to ride to the county seat myself. Silence outside, longer than before. Then Connell's voice, very quiet, like a door being carefully closed. I can't move a dying woman. Flat, final. Come back in the morning, Connell. Langley's voice, still controlled, but with something altered in it, something thinner under the surface. In the morning, Victor, something had shifted in the sheriff's voice. Not courage exactly, more like exhaustion reaching the limit of what it could sustain. Go home. Boots on frozen ground, several pairs moving away, then one more set, slower, deliberate, making absolutely certain everyone heard the reluctance in them. Then silence. The silence after was enormous. Owen exhaled from the back room. Daniel's knife hand dropped to his side. Emily spoke from beside her mother, not having moved from that position. Samuel, her voice was very quiet. Come here. He went. He crouched beside her and looked at Anna Hale and felt the floor of his stomach drop in a way it hadn't in a very long time. Anna Hale's breathing had changed again, not worsened precisely, simplified. The way a fire simplifies when it's running low on what it needs, burning cleaner and smaller and quieter. Sutton was already there, his hand on her wrist, his face telling a story he hadn't yet put words to. How long? Margaret said. It wasn't quite a question. Sutton looked at this 7-year-old who had kept her family alive by sheer sustained force of love and stubbornness, and he looked at her straight, which was, Thomas thought, possibly the most honest thing the man had done in months. I don't know, Sutton said. Her heart is still strong, but her lungs. Will the steam help? Margaret said. It will help, Sutton said, carefully. Will it help? Margaret said again, sharper. Yes, Sutton said, it will help. Margaret nodded once. She turned back to her mother. She took Anna's hand again in both of hers. And then she did the thing Thomas had heard her do in the night, the thing he had pretended not to hear. She began to sing, low, barely above breath, an old song, a simple song, the kind that mothers sing to daughters and daughters eventually sing back in the fullness of time. Clara's voice came from the doorway to the back room. I know that one, she said softly. I know you do, Margaret said. And Clara began to sing as well from her wheelchair in the doorway, her thin, clear voice weaving into her sister's, and for a moment the room held nothing but those two voices and the crackling fire and the sound of a mother breathing. Thomas stood and looked at the ceiling, which was the only direction he could look without his face doing something he didn't want anyone to see. Anna Hale's fingers, very slowly, tightened around her daughter's hand. She hears them, Owen whispered from the back doorway. She always hears us, Margaret said, still singing between the words. Outside, the snow had started again. He could hear it, the particular hush that descends on a world when snow is falling thick and steady. And from somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought began to take shape, not complete yet, not fully formed, but unmistakably moving toward something. Tomorrow Langley would return. Connell had delayed him, not stopped him. The sheriff's moment of clarity would last only as long as it took Langley to remind him what he stood to lose. But Beckett was speaking to Elena Calloway tonight. And Sutton had just said, within earshot of Margaret and Daniel Hale, what he had seen at a worksite and had chosen to record as something other than what it was. And two of Langley's men had ridden back to tell him that the documents from Robert Hale's coat were no longer in that coat. Let him wonder where they were. Thomas looked at Clara's wheelchair across the room, at the small shape beneath the layered blankets, at the documents that nobody with any sense would think to search for there. He had one night to use what he had, and in the morning, Caldwell Fork, Montana was going to have to determine what kind of town it was going to be. He looked at Margaret still singing beside her mother. She looked up at him once, brief as a struck match, and he saw something in her face he hadn't seen before. Not hope exactly, too cautious for that, too seasoned by everything the past months had taken from her to believe in things that arrived easily, but the edge of it, the shape hope makes before it commits to appearing. Thomas Arden pulled on his coat and went back out into the snow, and this time he knew exactly where he was going. Elena Calloway answered her door before Thomas knocked. She had been waiting. He could see it in how she stood, coat already on, lamp already lit, the posture of a woman who had made a decision and was impatient for something to do with it. Beckett talked, she said. Thomas stepped inside. Everything he's been carrying for 5 months. She set the lamp on the table and turned to face him. Her eyes were red at the rims, not from weeping, he thought, but from the specific exhaustion of listening to something terrible for a long time and holding it steady so the person telling it could reach the end. He was on the 3rd level when it happened, she said. He watched 2 of Langley's men with Robert Hale, and he saw what they did, and afterward one of them came to him and told him that his family would be provided for as long as he remembered it as an accident. Thomas was very still. He has a wife and 4 children, Elena continued. The youngest is 6. Her mouth was tight. They've been paying him not much, just enough to keep him grateful and quiet and drinking. She pressed her hands together on the table. He said he couldn't look at the Hale children when he saw them in town, said he crossed the street 4 months. He didn't know about the girls, about how they've been living, about Clara. He knows now, Thomas said. He wept, Elena said simply. A grown man at my kitchen table, he wept. She looked at Thomas. He'll testify. He said he doesn't care anymore what it costs him. He said a man can only cross the street so many times before the crossings are the whole of his life. Thomas thought about a father pressing documents into the lining of his coat in the dark, knowing what was coming, making certain his children would have something to stand on. "I need paper," he said, "and ink tonight." Elena was already moving to the writing desk. They worked past midnight. Thomas at the table, Elena beside him, constructing a written account of everything Beckett had said, everything Sutton had said, everything the county records showed, and what their gaps revealed. Beckett came down from above the livery at 11, smelling of whiskey and self-recrimination, and sat at the table and signed his own account in a hand that shook but didn't hesitate. When it was done, Thomas looked at what they had assembled. A sworn eyewitness account of deliberate murder, a physician's admission that his death certificate had been falsified under duress, property deeds establishing legal ownership of land with documented mineral value, a fraudulent debt claim traceable to a fictitious institution, a set of courthouse records whose removal had been authorized through the sheriff's office. Not a complete case, not clean, but enough. Enough for a territorial judge with any genuine interest in doing his job to pull the thread that would unravel the rest. 3 copies of everything, Thomas said. One goes to the county seat tonight. One stays with you. One goes to the children, Elena said, somewhere Langley can't reach. Thomas thought about Clara sleeping with the originals tucked under her blankets and allowed himself one small dark moment of something close to satisfaction. "Already handled," he said. Elena was making copies in her careful schoolteacher's hand when she looked up. "Thomas, the county seat is 4 hours by hard riding in good weather. Tonight there's snow." "Yes," he said. He was already buttoning his coat. "Do you know anyone with a fast horse?" She looked at him steadily. "My neighbor's son, he's 19. He's made that ride in weather like this before." She paused. "He has strong feelings about Langley. Langley bought his father's farm for a quarter of its value when the man had a difficult season." "Is he awake?" "He will be," Elena said and stood. 20 minutes later, a young man named Cole was riding south into the falling snow with a sealed packet inside his coat and instructions to put it directly into the hands of the territorial judge's clerk and no one else. Thomas watched him go, then walked back to Maple Street, arriving just before 2 in the morning to find Daniel still awake by the door and Margaret still beside her mother. Nothing had worsened. That was enough. He took the watch from 2 in the morning until dawn while the children slept. Anna Hale's breathing settled sometime around 4, not dramatically, no sudden improvement, just a subtle easing, like a vessel that has been fighting the current for hours and finds briefly calmer water. Sutton, who had fallen asleep in the corner with his coat as a pillow, stirred and checked her and said nothing, but something in his posture released fractionally. Thomas sat with the documents in his lap and thought about what the morning would bring. Langley would come back. Connell's delay was exactly that, a delay. Once daylight gave the legal process its cover, the court order would be enforced unless Thomas could generate enough public disruption in Caldwell Fork to make enforcing it politically impossible. A frontier town had a specific social physics. It could absorb a great deal of wrongdoing conducted quietly in the dark with no witnesses. What it could not absorb was wrongdoing conducted in public, in daylight, with a crowd present and making decisions about itself. Thomas needed a crowd. At 6 in the morning, he knocked on Elena Calloway's door. "Who in this town," he said when she opened it, "takes breakfast at the hotel every morning?" She blinked at him, pulled her robe tighter, thought. The merchants, the mill foreman, Hargrove from the bank, Colson who runs the livestock operation east of town, the men Langley does business with, most of them. Good, Thomas said. That's where I'm going. The hotel dining room was warm and smelled of coffee and fried meat and the particular comfortable sounds of men who have enough. Thomas walked in without hesitating, moved to the center of the room, and stood there until the conversations had quieted simply by the presence of his expression. 8 men, 3 tables. He recognized 2 of them. I apologize for the interruption, Thomas said, without sounding particularly sorry. My name is Thomas Arden. I've been in Coldwell Fork 3 days. I'm going to take 5 minutes of your time, and then you can decide what to do with what I've told you. He told them enough, not the full document inventory, not Beckett's name, not every specific detail, but enough. The mineral rights survey, the fraudulent debt claim, the falsified death certificate, the missing courthouse records. He told it without drama, the way you tell men who consider themselves practical people about the practical shape of something they've been complicit in by averting their eyes. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Marsh was staring at the table. The mill foreman had set down his fork. A man at the back, older, white-haired, with the hands of someone who has worked cattle land his whole life, was watching Thomas with an expression doing complex and uncomfortable work behind his eyes. Then Hargrove from the bank said, "That's a significant accusation against a significant man. You have evidence for any of this, or are you simply—" "I have signed documents at this moment en route to the territorial judge," Thomas said. "I have the original deeds on my person. I have a doctor who will formally correct his own death certificate this morning." He paused. "I also have a witness who was present when Robert Hale died, who has been paid 5 months of silence money by Langley's people and who is no longer willing to stay paid." The white-haired man at the back table set his coffee cup down with a deliberate sound. "Who's the witness?" he asked. "That comes out in a courtroom," Thomas said. "Not here." "Why are you telling us?" the mill foreman said. Careful, not hostile, the voice of a man working out whether he's in danger. "Because in approximately 2 hours," Thomas said, "Victor Langley is going to tell Sheriff Connell to go enforce a court order against a family with a dying mother and 4 children, one of whom cannot walk. And if the men in this town with any standing choose to be inside their buildings when that happens, Langley gets to conduct his business in the dark, with no one watching." He looked around the room. "I am asking you to watch. That's all. Come outside and watch. Let him do it in daylight with this town looking directly at it." Another silence, longer. Then the white-haired man said, without looking at anyone in particular, "Robert Hale sold me a horse in 1880. Good horse, fair price, looked me in the eye and shook my hand." He pushed back his chair. It scraped loudly in the quiet room. "I'll be on Maple Street." He left. After a moment, the mill foreman stood. He looked at Marsh. Marsh stared at the table. Then Marsh stood too, and he didn't look at Thomas, but he put his hat on and followed. Thomas walked back to Maple Street. By 8 in the morning, there were 14 people gathered on the street outside the cooperage, standing in the snow without particular organization. Not quite a crowd, more like a congregation. People who had come separately and stood near one another because proximity felt like a form of statement. The white-haired rancher, Elena Calloway, who had arrived with 2 women Thomas didn't know. The mill foreman, a woman from the church. Beckett, standing slightly apart from everyone, hands in his coat pockets, staring at the ground. Daniel saw them from the doorway. He came to stand beside Thomas. "They came. Some of them," Thomas said. "Is it enough?" "I don't know yet." Langley arrived at 8:30. He came with Connell, 2 deputies, and the broad-shouldered man from the day before. He stopped when he saw the people on the street, and the calculation moving behind his eyes was visible from 20 feet away, visible, and for the first time, uncertain. He was perhaps 58, well-made coat, good hat, the face of a man who had been comfortable for so long that comfort had reshaped his features from the inside, softening everything that should have stayed sharp. He was not physically imposing. He had never needed to be. He had spent 2 decades being the largest presence in every room through means other than size. He looked at Thomas. Arden, his voice was still level, still managed. You've complicated this unnecessarily. On the basis of a debt claim filed against a financial institution that doesn't exist, Thomas said, loudly enough for everyone on the street to hear, in a county where your attorney authorized the removal of courthouse documents supporting a. I'll stop you there. Langley turned to the gathered people with the practiced ease of a man who has talked his way through everything his entire life. I understand there are concerns. I want to address those concerns appropriately through the proper legal channels where. I was on the 3rd level. Beckett's voice came from near the back of the small crowd. Rough, unsteady, the voice of a man who has been underwater for 5 months and has just broken the surface. I was there when Robert Hale went over. I saw what happened. I watched 2 men put him over that railing. Your men. His voice cracked on the last word and then steadied. And afterward, I was told to say it was an accident, and I did. I said it was an accident, and I am standing here in front of every person on this street telling you that I did, and I am done. Elena Calloway put her hand on Beckett's arm. He didn't look at her, but some of the trembling in him eased. Connell had gone the color of old ash. He was standing slightly apart from Langley now, a physical distance of perhaps 2 feet, and Thomas watched him establish it and understood precisely what it meant. Sutton came out of the cooperage. Thomas hadn't asked him to. He simply appeared in the doorway with his coat and his bag, walked out onto the street, and stood beside Thomas without a word. Langley looked at him. Something in his voice was different now, not smooth, not the calm of a man managing a problem, something with edges in it. Sutton. The death certificate I filed for Robert Hale was inaccurate, Sutton said, to the street, not to Langley, clear and loud, and carrying the specific dignity of a man returning something he should never have borrowed. The injuries were inconsistent with a structural accident. I have written a corrected account, signed and witnessed, currently in the possession of 2 separate parties. One of the women in the crowd made a sound, a low, involuntary intake of breath. The kind that happens when something you have suspected but never allowed yourself to fully believe is confirmed in daylight. You are making a serious error, Langley said, very quiet now, the specific quietness of a threat. I made my serious error 5 months ago, Sutton said. The mill foreman stepped forward from the crowd. His voice was unsteady, but it kept moving. I've worked Langley's mill 8 years. I knew about the survey since last fall. I knew what that land was worth. Langley told me directly. He told me Carter had been dealt with. He stopped, seemed to realize the full weight of what he'd just said, and the realization settled visibly on his shoulders. I told myself I didn't know what that meant. I persuaded myself I didn't know. He looked at the ground. I knew. The white-haired rancher stepped forward and stood beside Sutton. He said nothing. He simply stood on a particular side of a particular line, and every person on that street understood what it meant. Connell took another step away from Langley. Langley saw it. He turned to face his sheriff slowly. Connell looked at him. He looked like a man who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has decided, with complex and somewhat exhausted feelings, to set it down. I can't enforce this order, Victor. You have a legal obligation. I have a great many things. Connell's voice was tired, specifically, precisely tired. I'm going to ride to the county seat today and speak with the judge directly. Whatever comes of that will come through proper legal channels. He looked at Thomas. The family stays where they are until this is fully resolved. Langley stood in the middle of the street and looked at the faces around him. Faces that had been looking past him for years, that had made their private arrangements and their private accommodations, and that were now, one by one, looking at him directly. Looking through him, really, to what they had permitted, and to what they were choosing, right now, in the snow on Maple Street, not to permit any longer. He was still standing there, very straight, very still, when Thomas turned away from him and went inside. Margaret was beside her mother. She didn't look up when Thomas came in. She was watching Anna Hale's face with a ferocious concentration, as though the quality of her attention could itself keep a person here. I can hear them, Margaret said, outside the voices. It's going to be all right, Thomas said. She looked up at him then. Her face did something complicated. You don't know that, she said. No, he admitted, but I believe it. She looked at him for a long moment, then she turned back to her mother. Mama, softly, can you hear me? A pause. Something happened outside, something good. Her voice caught slightly and held. Thomas did it, Mama. He went out there and he told the truth and people listened. She stopped. I think Papa would have liked him, she said. I think Papa would have recognized him. Anna Hale's hand moved. Barely a small shift of the fingers against the blanket, but deliberate, the movement of someone fighting back toward the surface from somewhere very deep. She moved, Owen said from the doorway. He sounded stunned. She hears you, Clara said. I keep telling everyone she always hears us. Margaret pressed both hands over her mouth. Just for a moment, one moment where the accumulated weight of all of it tried to come through at once, and she held it. Then she lowered her hands, and she was steady again, the way she was always steady, the way that only someone who has had to be steady for everyone else can be. She looked up at Thomas. She moved, she said. I know, Thomas said. She's going to be all right. He did not say what the doctor would have said, that it wasn't certain, that it was still very serious, that one movement of the hand was not a prognosis, because Margaret was not asking him for medical information. She was telling him something she had decided with the specific ferocity of a 7-year-old who had been right about things before, when everyone around her had been wrong, and he found that he believed her. She is, he said. Outside, the snow had stopped. Through the crack in the board over the window, the particular pale clarity of winter light, when the clouds have finally broken, was making its way into the room, falling in a single bar across the floor. Daniel came in from the street and said, Langley's gone, in the tone of a person reporting something they haven't finished absorbing yet. Owen said, Is it over? Daniel said, Not all of it, but some of it. Owen sat down on the floor and put his face in his hands and made no sound. Clara reached forward from her wheelchair and placed her hand on Owen's head. He reached up and held it without looking. Thomas stood against the wall and looked at these 4 children in the pale winter light and thought about Robert Hale pressing documents into the lining of a coat in the dark, hoping someone would come, hoping someone would find them, hoping someone would stay. He had not been the man Robert Hale would have prayed for, most likely. He was not young, not uncomplicated, not without a long catalogue of things he'd left undone and people he'd failed to remain with. He was a man who had sold his ranch and started walking because standing still was something he had forgotten how to do. But he had stopped. That was the thing. He had stopped walking and walked toward instead, and whatever came next, the judge, the legal proceedings, the long and complicated work of dismantling what Langley had constructed and accounting for what it had cost, he had stopped. And staying, it turned out, was the most important thing he'd done in a very long time. Margaret's voice, quiet as breath. Thomas, are you going to leave when it's over? He looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching her mother's face, waiting for the next small sign of movement, the next evidence of someone fighting back toward the light. I don't know yet, he said honestly. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've learned to value genuine uncertainty more than comfortable assurance. Okay, she said. And she kept watch over her mother, and Thomas kept watch over all of them. And outside on Maple Street, the people of Caldwell Forks stood in the cold and looked at one another, and began, quietly, haltingly, with some considerable difficulty, the process of deciding what came next. The territorial judge arrived in Caldwell Fork 11 days later. His name was Aldous Crane, and he was a man who had spent 25 years on the frontier bench, developing a particular tolerance for the ways in which small towns permit powerful men to operate. A tolerance that had long since curdled into something that from the outside looked a great deal like impatience. He read the documents Thomas had sent ahead with Cole. He read Beckett's account. He read Sutton's corrected death certificate. He examined the property deeds alongside the mineral rights survey and the fraudulent debt claim, and he sat with the county records, the gaps in them, the removal dates, the authorization signatures, for a long time without speaking. Then he looked up at Connell, who had ridden to the county seat himself and returned, and was standing in Crane's temporary office at the hotel with the posture of a man who has decided that whatever this costs him is what it costs him. You knew, Crane said, not a question. Not all of it, Connell said, not about Hale, I swear that honestly. He didn't look away, but the records, the removal, yes, I let it happen. Crane regarded him for a moment. Your badge is suspended pending the full inquiry. You'll cooperate fully with everything that follows. Yes, sir, Connell said simply. No argument, no negotiation. The tone of a man settling a debt he accrued himself. Victor Langley was taken into custody that same afternoon. He did not go loudly, but he did not go quietly either. He went the way men go when the structure they've spent years building around themselves collapses all at once, with a rigid, mechanical disbelief, his body moving through the process before his mind had finished refusing it. Ferris, his attorney, resigned his filings and rode out of Caldwell Fork before sundown. The two men who had come to the cooperage were identified by Beckett and held for questioning. Thomas stood on the street and watched Langley's carriage roll away under escort and felt nothing dramatic, just a settling, the particular quiet of something that has been wrong for a long time being made right, not made whole, not undone entirely, but addressed, which was what the law could offer, and which was, on this occasion, enough. He turned and walked back to Maple Street. Anna Hale had first opened her eyes fully 4 days after the confrontation. Not spoken yet, speech came later, slow and fragile, the voice of lungs that had been through a long war. But her eyes had opened and found Margaret's face, and Margaret had said, "Hi, Mama," in a voice that didn't shake at all, because she had practiced not shaking for so long that she could do it even then, even in that moment. And then her face had crumpled completely for about 30 seconds before she reassembled it and said, "You're all right. I've been telling you that every single day." Anna had reached up and touched her daughter's face. That was enough for one day. By the time Judge Crane arrived and the proceedings began, Anna was sitting up. By the time the first formal charges were filed, She could speak in full sentences, though Sutton still came every morning and still told her not to push too hard. She obeyed with the specific compliance of a woman who intended to ignore the instruction the moment she had sufficient strength to manage it. She looked different than Thomas had expected. When you've watched someone fight their way back from the edge for 2 weeks, you construct an image of them from the struggle alone. Anna Hale sitting up and present was all of that and also something else. Kind, that was the word. A face built for noticing things, for specific and steady attention, for making whoever was near her feel like the most important person in whatever room she occupied. He understood immediately where Margaret had learned it. And he understood immediately what losing it had been doing to these children, slowly, systematically, from the inside. She said you sat with her, Anna told him on the 5th day she was able to speak. Margaret had told her everything, and the telling had taken most of a morning. I was in the same room, Thomas said. That's what sitting with someone means, Anna said. He didn't have an answer for that. She said you found what Robert hid, Anna said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness required effort. He could hear the effort. She said you knew where to look. She told me about it, Thomas said. Your husband did the hard part. He made sure it was there to find. Anna looked at her hands for a moment. He knew, she said quietly. He tried to tell me. I thought he was worrying. He was a man who worried, but he knew what was coming. She looked up. Did he have time, do you know? At the end, did he have enough time? He had time enough, Thomas said carefully. He put the documents where they'd be found. He made sure the land was documented in your children's names. He made certain someone could find everything necessary. He paused. A man who does all that has had enough time. Anna looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded slowly and looked away. Whatever she did with that grief, she did it privately, which was her right. The legal process moved faster than Thomas had expected, partly because of Judge Crane's particular disposition, and partly because Langley's structure, once its foundations were properly examined, turned out to be considerably less solid than it had appeared. The fraudulent debt claim was invalidated. The original property deeds, Robert Hale's deeds, the ones sewn into the lining of his coat, were entered into the county record in the names of Anna Hale and her children. The mineral rights, the survey, the oil beneath the eastern pasture, all of it confirmed and documented and signed by a judge who had no financial relationship with anyone in Caldwell Fork and intended to preserve that distinction. Beckett testified. His voice shook through most of it, but it shook forward, and when he finished, he sat in the hall outside the proceedings, and Alina Calloway sat beside him and said nothing, which was what he needed. Sutton testified, dispassionate, clinical, precise, giving the medical facts with the composure of a man who has decided that accuracy is the only currency he has left and intends to spend every last bit of it. Moore, the mill foreman, testified about what Langley had told him the previous fall. He lost his position within the week. He sat outside the hotel afterward with his hat in his hands, and Thomas sat beside him for a while, and they didn't talk about much. "What'll you do?" Thomas asked eventually. "Work it out," Moore said. He turned his hat in his hands. "A man's got to start from somewhere." "He does," Thomas agreed. The town of Caldwell Fork did not transform overnight. Thomas was old enough to know that truth and to not be diminished by it. People who had looked away for months did not become different people in a week. The shame of what they'd permitted worked on them the way most meaningful change works, slowly and privately, not in dramatic public moments, but in small repeated choices, the kind that accumulate over months into something that eventually resembles character. But some things happened quickly. Alina Calloway organized a collection within 3 days of Langley's arrest. a jar on Marsh's counter, which Marsh permitted with a red face and no comment, and people put money in it. Some because they genuinely wanted to help. Some because they needed something concrete between themselves and what they'd failed to do before. The effect was the same regardless of the motive. The jar filled, then a second jar, then a tin from the church. The money went first to a proper wheelchair, not the bent, rattling frame Clara had been living in since before the worst of winter. A real one, well-made, ordered from a specialist in Helena on Elena's specific and detailed written instructions. When it arrived and Daniel lifted Clara into it for the first time, she ran both hands along the wheel rim slowly. The way you touch something you aren't certain is entirely real. "It doesn't lean," she said. "No," Daniel said. His voice was rough. "The other one was always laning." She pushed forward, then back, learning the feel of it. "This one is mine." "That one is yours," Daniel confirmed. Clara looked over at Thomas, who was standing nearby and finding something of great apparent interest to examine on the far wall. "Thomas," she said. Thank you." He looked at her then. This child with her large, patient eyes and her extraordinary stillness and her absolute refusal, regardless of what the world offered as reasons, to make herself smaller than she was. "I didn't buy the chair, Clara. The town did." "I know," Clara said, "but you made the town." He didn't have an answer for that either. The second thing the collection paid for was a specialist in Billings who worked with conditions affecting the legs, a consultation that Sutton arranged personally, with the tenacity of a man who understands exactly how much he owes and is spending the only currency currently available to him. The specialist came in April when the roads were passable and spent 2 full hours with Clara while the family waited in the outer room with the particular stillness that is really a kind of noise, too careful, too controlled, everyone's breathing slightly wrong. When the doctor emerged, he sat across from Anna and spoke to her directly. "The condition is permanent," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that. There is no procedure that will restore full function." He paused, "but with the correct exercises maintained consistently, the remaining function can be strengthened considerably. She has more than I would expect given her circumstances." He glanced toward the back room where Clara had been left to rest. "She's been compensating for a long time. She understands her body very well." "She understands everything very well," Margaret said from the corner. The doctor looked at this small, serious girl who had been sitting with her arms around her knees through the entire 2-hour wait. "Your sister?" "Yes, sir. She told me about you," the doctor said. "She said you sing to her when her legs cramp at night." Margaret's chin lifted slightly. "It helps." She said it does." He looked back at Anna. "Whatever you're doing for her, the medicine is real and the love is also real. In my experience, both matter in equal measure." Anna closed her eyes for a moment. Then she opened them and said, "Thank you, doctor," with the full dignity of a woman who had spent 6 weeks on the floor of an abandoned building and had come back from it with nothing diminished. Thomas repaired the Hale house himself, mostly. He had the skills from 40 years of ranch work and more time available than he'd had in decades. He replaced the boards on the windows first, then the section of wall the winter had pushed through, then the roof where the cold had found a way inside. Daniel worked beside him, learning without being explicitly taught, handing tools before being asked, climbing where Thomas pointed without discussion. They worked in a particular masculine silence that was actually a long conversation about a great many things. One morning about 3 weeks in, Daniel said, without preamble, "You going to stay?" Thomas drove in a nail, checked it, "Seems like it." For good. Don't know about good. He reached for the next board. For now, that's usually how it works. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Margaret said she knew you wouldn't leave, he said then. His voice was neutral, but something moved underneath it. She said it 2 days after you got here. I told her men like that always move on sooner. Or later, she said, not this one, just like that. Didn't explain herself, went back to tending Mama. Thomas turned back to the wall. She's a perceptive child, he said. She's always right, Daniel said. It's genuinely aggravating. Thomas smiled at the wall where Daniel couldn't see it. Spring came the way Montana springs come, not gently, not gradually, but with a sudden decisive warmth that felt like the season had made up its mind all at once and acted before anyone could argue against it. The snow melted fast, the ground turned soft, and the Hale farm, which was what it was again, legally and entirely, with the deeds filed and the mineral rights secured, and a land management agreement brokered by the territorial office that would generate income for the family for years, began to look like itself again. Anna planted seeds in the kitchen garden the first week she had the strength to kneel. Margaret knelt beside her in the same row, close enough that their arms kept touching and neither of them moved over. Owen built a small ramp for Clara's wheelchair so she could move from the porch to the yard without help. He built it 3 times before the angle was right. The third version held. Clara rolled down it and said, "Finally, Owen." Owen said, "You're welcome." They looked at each other with the warm aggravation of siblings who have been through too much together to pretend they don't love one another completely. One evening in late April, Thomas was sitting on the porch steps with a cup of coffee when Margaret came and sat beside him. She was 7 now, had turned 7 in March, a birthday that the town had contributed to in the form of a cake from the bakehouse that Clara had declared the finest thing she had ever eaten, and that Margaret had taken 2 bites of before quietly wrapping the remainder up for her brothers. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "You can ask me anything," Thomas said. "When you first saw us in the alley," she was looking at the last of the light on the mountains, that long Montana evening light that seems to last forever and then simply isn't there. "Did you know then that you were going to stay?" Thomas considered that honestly. "No," he said. "I was going to get supplies and bring them over. That was all I was going to do." "So what changed?" He turned his cup in his hands and thought about it. "Nothing changed," he said. "I just kept choosing the next thing, stay the night, stay tomorrow, find out about the courthouse, talk to Beckett, fix the roof." He paused. "That's how most things actually get done, I think, not one large choice, many small ones." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, very quietly, "My papa made a lot of small choices too, all the way to the end." "He did," Thomas said. "He kept choosing us," she said, "even when he couldn't anymore." Thomas said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be smaller than what she'd just offered. The evening settled around them. From inside the house, Clara was talking to Anna in that particular Clara way, rapid and certain, convinced that every thought she had was of urgent importance to whoever was nearby, and correct about that more often than not. Daniel's voice, low and steady somewhere, Owen laughing at something. Margaret finished her coffee. She set the cup down and looked at Thomas. "I'm glad you stopped," she said. "So am I," Thomas said. She went inside. He sat on the steps for a while longer in the last of the light and thought about the 63 years he'd spent moving across this country, the cattle operations and the long drives and the distances he'd put between himself and anything that might require him to stay, to be accountable, to be the thing that held something else up. He had told himself for years that he was a man built for motion, that the open range was his nature, and that anything more settled would diminish him somehow. He understood now that he had been wrong, and that it had taken two girls in a frozen alleyway dividing a piece of bread with the precision and reciprocal generosity of people who had more than enough, not food, but something more essential, to show him what he had spent so long walking away from. He had come to Caldwell Fork going nowhere. He had come in from the cold and found a family holding each other up with nothing but love and stubbornness and the absolute refusal to let one another go. And he had stayed. Years later, when people in Caldwell Fork told the story, and they did tell it, often the way communities tell the stories that define what they decided to become, they always said that Thomas Arden had saved the Hale family. And Thomas always said the same thing every single time, patient and consistent as a man who has a particular truth he intends to keep repeating until people hear it. He said he hadn't saved anyone. He said he had stopped walking and walked toward instead, and what he'd found when he arrived had saved him. He said there was a little girl who had divided the last piece of bread in the world down the middle and given the larger portion away, who had fed her sister before herself, who had sung in the dark when there was nothing left to sing about, who had told him her father checked everything twice and meant it as testimony, as compass, as a way of moving through a world that does not always reward that kind of care. He said that child had walked him back to himself, without meaning to, without calculating it, without asking for anything in return except that he keep choosing the next small thing. That was the truth of it. Not the deeds, not the judge, not Langley's arrest or Beckett's testimony or any of the things that looked, from the outside, like the turning point. The turning point was an alley and a piece of bread, and a 7-year-old girl pressing the larger half into her sister's lap in the cold. That was the night one tired old man remembered that a life doesn't have to end simply because you've forgotten where you were going. It just has to find somewhere worth stopping for. And he had.